any newcomers today. Special welcome. So, who thinks that you are dressed like a UU right now? Raise your hand if you think. Okay. Anybody online raising their hands? Maybe someone's in flaming chalice pajamas? So raise your hand if you don't know whether you're dressed like a UU, because you don't know what that even means. Yeah? Have some of those. Not as many, but some of them. So there is no dress code here or in any UU context, to my knowledge, or that can always be tested, right? There probably have some limits on that. Yet somehow there is a perception that we might be recognizable as UU based on our appearance.
Family persons.
Okay, I had no idea what that is. I am learning to do still about Unitarian Universalism. I suspect that some of us feel resistance to the idea that we might be identified with a group because of the way we look. Many of us like to think of ourselves as individuals, and we are enculturated to do so. All of this is culture. Some of it visible, most of it invisible. Some of you have probably encountered the iceberg analogy for culture, developed by anthropologist Edward Hall in the 1970s. We have a slide, Nicholas, if you want to put that up. So there's one rendering of it, which I got from the United Church of Canada's website. Hall used the metaphor of an iceberg to explain that the parts of culture that we can observe with our senses, clothes, food, gestures, music, art, symbols, and traditions, are just the very tip of the iceberg, the 10%. The far greater mass lies below the surface, all the unarticulated and intangible aspects of culture. The tip of the iceberg is the what of culture, what we do, while the mass of the iceberg below the surface is the why we do what we do. The 90% of culture that's below the surface are the unspoken assumptions, values, beliefs, attitudes, and expectations that drive what we do. When we think about the shaping function of culture, we can turn off the slide now, thank you, Nicholas. When we think about the shaping function of culture, what is below the surface is far more powerful than what's above. And unless we are aware of what's below the surface, it's very difficult to make changes in what we do, changes that last, even if the change is something that we want. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Great. So culture isn't just what we do, it's also why we do it. All the ways that we make shared meaning and create a sense of group cohesion that endures over time. Congregations have cultures, strong ones. Suzanne talked about what it's been like for her as a relatively new member here to enter this congregational culture. So think about that iceberg image again. When Suzanne talked about our clothes, our signage, and our language, she was talking about the tip of USM's cultural iceberg. And when she talked about how decisions are made here, she was right at the water's edge. The fifth principle and our practice of congregational voting are above the surface. Use of the democratic process is an explicit part of our culture. But when Suzanne says she's curious about what we vote on, what is deemed worthy of collective discernment, she's peering below the surface. And that's a lot harder to make out. Culture is incredibly powerful. It shapes not only what we do, but who we are, even when we're deeply embedded in a culture, what's possible for us to perceive or think. It's often hard for those of us who have been inside a culture for a long time to recognize it as culture, because to us it's just how things are, just the way we do things. So when someone newer to the culture, like Suzanne or Reverend Terry, asks, hey, why do you do this thing? Or why do you do it in this particular way? Those of us who have been here a while might be surprised. What? Why wouldn't we do it? Or is there even another way? And that's one of the many, many reasons why newcomers are so incredibly important. Kids too, by the way, kids are the best at asking why. A transition time is an excellent time to ask ourselves why. Why are we here? Why do we do what we do in the way that we do it? When asked why, we have the opportunity to pause and reflect, to peer below the surface of our cultural iceberg, to explore why. And in so doing, we not only get to know ourselves better, we also get the chance to decide whether or not we want to keep doing things in the way we've been doing them. Suddenly, possibilities open up that we may not have considered before. And that's why we're talking about culture today, both in the worship service and afterward in our community conversation. Because if we want to be more intentional about shaping our future, which is what we're doing in this transition time, we need to become aware of our culture and how it supports or impedes who we want to become. So enough high-level stuff. Let's consider some examples. And I'm going to focus on worship because it's something we're all experiencing together right now. There are no instructions or guidelines about how to behave in worship here at UUSM, but there are very strong, unspoken norms the newcomers have to figure out if they want to fit in. We don't call out during worship, for one thing.
Amen.
Thank goodness for Terry. Because there is no rule against calling out. It can be super engaging when you're up here going on and on about something you thought was a really good idea yesterday, and you don't hear anything back. It's really nice sometimes to get a little amen. Amen? Amen. Thank you. So calling out in worship can be a really great thing. It's just not part of the culture at USM, at least not right now. Why? What are the values, beliefs, and attitudes that lead us to be quiet and still during worship? Those values are not the same as the values stated in our congregational covenant, principles, or mission statement. Nothing in our group agreement says we have to sit still and be silent during worship, right? There's something else driving why we do worship this way. What are the values that are unexpressed and yet still powerfully shaping how we do things? What's below the surface of our iceberg? And what about sitting or standing during congregational singing? This is a really interesting example right now because there was an intentional culture shift here under our last music director, Joel Chapman. Joel helped us realize that an expectation to rise for music excludes folks for whom rising is difficult or impossible. And even though we always used to say something the equivalent of please rise in body or spirit, standing for hymns was definitely the cultural norm, as it is in many congregations. And so Joel initiated a culture change, explicitly inviting people to remain seated if they'd like for congregational singing. Jeremy is continuing this inclusive practice of welcoming us to do with our bodies what's right for each of us when we sing. Amen. Amen. For some, it feels awkward not having a clear directive because it's so deeply ingrained that the congregation should move as one during singing. But that's cultural. It's not a requirement for good music or good worship. In this example, there are competing values at play. The value of the congregation moving together as one, and the value of inclusivity for people with different abilities and needs. Both are worthy values, but they are in tension in this case. And the result is some rippling of the waters, right? A little bit of confusion, maybe, particularly for new folks, trying to figure out what's expected when we sing together. Competing values are often at play in groups, and they create ripples. Interesting, right? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here's another example. Some of you, particularly Jack, but probably others as well, probably noticed that I am messing a lot these days with passing the peace. until I started messing with it. Passing the peace was several minutes long, remember? It was about 1/3 of the way through the service, and folks would get up and walk around, greeting one another, hugging and chatting. Some of you still do this, even though we've been trying to rein it in for a couple of months. And it's okay. I totally expected that. It's a deeply rooted cultural tradition. When I was an intern here, Passing of the Peace was a full-on party, complete with loud music, like Sister Sledge's "We Are Family." Remember that one? I remember that one clearly. For many of us, it was fun. Who doesn't love a party in the middle of worship? Well, my beloved extroverts and party people, let me tell you, introverts don't necessarily love it, nor do folks who arrive so heartsick or stressed out, they just want an hour where they don't have to put on their game faces, force a smile, and socialize. People for whom getting up and milling about is difficult probably don't like it. For our Zoom folks, it's not really all that great, although they might go get a cup of coffee, but they're not connecting the way we are here. Newcomers like me, when I started attending a UU congregation 15 years ago, who lurk in the back intentionally, might not like it. Some of us need to work up to Connections Hour gradually and don't want to be forced into it during worship. So there's a reason I'm messing with Passing of the Peace, my friends. Right now we're trying it at the start of worship as part of our gathering. That might not work, but we're giving it a try. And because this is a cultural issue, it's not up to me whether it works or not, whether any of the changes I make stick. When I'm gone, maybe you'll go right back to the way it was and tell stories about how that party-pooping transitional minister tried to ruin the fun of Passing of the Peace, right? And I'll love you no matter what you do. But I do want you to know why I'm messing with this tradition. It's part of a larger concern. What's welcoming to some isn't welcoming to others. I hope as we try out new approaches to greeting one another, you will be open to thinking about it in a new way. Just as I hope you'll be open to thinking about all the things that come up during this transition time with Rev Terry and me. I hope when Rev Terry or I or Suzanne or another newcomer or an inquisitive child asks why, you'll allow yourselves to be curious. Why indeed? What are we trying to accomplish? Do we even know? Or is it just something we do because it's familiar and comfortable to those of us who have been here for a while? Or because we've been taught to do it by those who came before? There's a parable about this. Some of you may know it. I just learned it from Rev Terry last week. One day, after school, a young kid watched their mom cutting off the ends of a pot roast before putting it in the oven. They had seen Mom do this many times before, but today it occurred to them to ask, why? Why do you cut the ends off the pot roast before cooking it, Mom? Are they bad or something? Mom paused. Well, I guess I don't know why. It's what my mom always did. Why don't you ask her? So the child called Grandma. Grandma, why do you cut the ends off the pot roast before cooking it? Grandma thought a moment and replied, well, it's how my mom taught me to do it, sweetie, and I never asked why. Why don't you ask her? So the persistent child called Great Grandma. The ends of the pot roast, Great Grandma, why? And Great Grandma said with a laugh, honey, I had a very small pan. The roast wouldn't kick in unless I cut the ends off. When you start poking around in a human system, you come upon stories like this. Congregations are no different. That disruptive persons policy, it has a story. If the finances are managed in a super complicated way involving double and triple checks on every expenditure, there's probably a story there too. It's good to check in periodically about why we do things the way we do. Perhaps the original reason is no longer applicable, and there's a better way we might do it to meet our current needs and align with the values we want to express. Here's another way of looking at the same phenomena. It's a little closer to home and a little more tender than the pot roast story. When something traumatic happens in a congregation, like the sudden departure of a settled minister, the emotional reactions can become embedded in the culture. Mistrust in particular, when left untended and unhealed, can become part of the culture. And that's never good for the health of a system. Some of the aspects of our culture now likely come from past wounds, even if, as with the pot roast, we don't know what those past wounds were. The scars remain as part of the culture, shaping us, whether we're aware of it or not. So what can we do now to ensure that the most recent pain points don't become part of our culture, limiting who we might become? This too is part of our transition work, and we will be focusing on this aspect more next month in March when we address the topic of shared ministry. Looking at ourselves and our culture can be really uncomfortable. It makes us feel vulnerable, and feeling vulnerable can make us defensive. And that's understandable. It's just part of the process of self-reflection and assessment. And I want you to know, if you're feeling apprehensive about all this, none of this is about judgment. None of it is about being a good or a bad congregation, as if there even was such a thing. It's not about forcing you to become different from who you want to be as a community. This is about helping you discern together who you uniquely are as a congregation, who you want to become, and what you need to do to get there, where you want to go. It's about helping you shape your future with intention. And the reason culture matters in all this is because culture is more important than strategy, more powerful than organizational structure, new ideas or new programs, or even the very best minister. You could have all these things: a great strategy, a clear and beautifully laid out organizational chart, an awesome new minister, exciting new programs, but if the culture isn't receptive in some way, it won't matter. They won't take. I started with the cultural iceberg, which is a little cold and imposing, so I want to leave you with another metaphor. The word culture shares the same root as agriculture, of course. Cultivation, the science and art of growing things that we want to grow. In agriculture, we focus on tending and tilling the soil so it will yield what we want. If we want to grow tomatoes, we need loamy soil, rich with minerals and the right pH level. So if we want good tomatoes, we're going to have to study our soil and amend it so it's fertile ground for tomatoes. So my friends, what we're inviting you to consider at this point in the transition process is what our soil is like here. Is it conducive to what we want to grow? Will it nurture what we seek to create and become? Most likely, the answer will be yes and no. Our challenge is to figure out what in the culture is conducive to what we want to grow and what in the culture is not. Likely, we'll need to amend it in some ways to create the best conditions for flourishing. This is not a task your leaders can do without you, my friends. It has to be a shared effort. We'll reap the best harvest when we have a clear, shared vision of what we want to grow, and each of us helps turn and enrich the soil. So stay for the community conversation after the service. Mark your calendars for the next one, which is on March 10th, and engage in the transition work. help us turn and enrich the soil of this beloved community. May it be so. And amen.